Marlene Hoffman always believed she knew her life perfectly well. At 47, she had built a life that many would consider enviable in the small town of Bamberg, Bavaria. Married for 25 years to Klaus Hoffmann, a respected engineer in the local community, and mother to two grown children, Sebastian, 23, and Julia, 21, Marlene seemed to have everything under control. Her two-story house on Wilhelmsplatz was immaculate, her garden always well-tended, and she maintained a routine that oscillated between her job as a secretary at a local medical clinic and the social engagements typical of a middle-class German woman. But behind the perfect facade, Marlene felt a growing emptiness. It wasn't something she could easily explain to her friends during their Thursday coffee dates in the city center, nor to Klaus during the rare, intimate conversations they still had. It was more of a persistent feeling that life was passing her by, that at 47, with her children practically independent and a marriage that functioned more out of habit than passion, all she had left was to wait for time to pass until retirement and eventually the arrival of grandchildren. Klaus noticed his wife's growing distance, but attributed it to the stress of being a young mother and domestic responsibilities. At 37, he was satisfied with his life. He had a young, beautiful wife, a lovely daughter, and a stable career. For Klaus, Marlene was more of a trophy than a partner, although he would never consciously admit this. He liked to show her off at social events, proud that he had managed to marry someone 12 years younger. The turning point in Marlene's life began seemingly innocently in March 2023. She had decided to join a language learning app, motivated by a sudden desire to learn Arabic. She couldn't explain exactly why she chose that language specifically. Perhaps it was the exoticism, perhaps it was a form of mental escapism, a way to connect with a world completely different from her predictable everyday life in Bamberg. The app had a chat function where students could practice with native speakers. That's how Marlene met Ahmed Al-Rashid. At least, that was the name he used. He said he was 35 years old, from Dubai, worked in his family's real estate business, and was interested in learning German to expand the family business in Europe. The first conversations were purely linguistic. Ahmed corrected Marlene's hesitant Arabic, and she helped him with more complex German expressions. But gradually, the conversations became more personal. Ahmed was charming, attentive, and showed a genuine interest in Marlene's life that she hadn't felt in years. He asked questions about her dreams, her fears, her frustrations. He listened to her answers with an attention that Klaus had long since lost. What Marlene didn't know was that every piece of information she shared was being carefully catalogued and analyzed. Ahmed, whose real name was Karim Ben Ali, a 43-year-old man born in Casablanca, Morocco, was an experienced predator. He had spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of identifying and manipulating middle-aged Western women who felt neglected in their marriages. Karim had a refined system. He maintained profiles on multiple platforms, always posing as wealthy Arab men from Persian Gulf countries. The choice was not accidental. There was something about the image of the Arab prince that held a particular fascination for certain European women, a mixture of exoticism, presumed wealth, and a masculinity perceived as more intense than that of their domestic partners. Marlene began to eagerly await Ahmed's messages. He wrote to her every morning, wishing her a good day, and every night, saying goodbye with affectionate words in Arabic that he translated for her. Gradually, the conversations migrated from the language app to WhatsApp, then to voice calls, and finally to video calls. Ahmed always appeared on video calls in luxurious settings: stylish offices, expensive cars, sophisticated restaurants. What Marlene didn't realize was that these locations were carefully chosen, often public or borrowed spaces that Karim used specifically for his video calls with potential victims. He had invested in expensive clothes and accessories that complemented his persona as a prosperous businessman. The transformation in Marlene was gradual, but noticeable. Klaus noticed that his wife was more animated, more careful with her appearance, and on the phone more often. Initially, he assumed she had made a new friend at work or reconnected with an old colleague. Marlene, for her part, became adept at hiding her conversations with Ahmed, developing a secret intimacy that made her feel more alive than she had in years. Ahmed was a master of emotional timing. He knew exactly when to be available and when to make himself a little scarce, creating a dynamic of anxiety and relief that intensified Marlene's feelings for him. He made her feel special, desired, interesting. He told stories about his life in Dubai, about traveling the world, about international business, painting a picture of a glamorous and exciting existence that contrasted sharply with Marlene's domestic routine. In May 2023, 2 months after their first contact, Ahmed made his first mention of temporary financial difficulties. He explained that he was involved in a large real estate transaction, but that some funds were temporarily blocked due to international bureaucratic issues. It was a complex story, involving Swiss banks, European regulations, and Saudi investors, told with enough detail to sound convincing, but not so specific that it could be easily verified. Marlene, completely emotionally invested, did not question the details. In fact, she felt honored that Ahmed trusted her enough to share his financial concerns. When he mentioned almost casually that a small amount in euros could help resolve the situation temporarily, Marlene did not hesitate to offer help. The first transfer was only 500 euros. Ahmed was effusive in his gratitude, promising to return the money in a matter of days. He even sent documents that looked official, showing the real estate transaction in question, complete with bank logos and impressive stamps. Marlene kept the documents carefully, more as mementos of her generosity than as legal guarantees. Klaus noticed that Marlene had made an unusual withdrawal from their joint savings account, but when he asked about it, she explained that she had lent money to a colleague who was experiencing difficulties. It was a simple lie, and Klaus did not investigate further. After all, 500 euros was not an alarming amount, and Marlene had always been generous with friends and family. June arrived in Bamberg with unusual heat for the region, and with it came an escalation in the intensity of the virtual relationship between Marlene and Ahmed. What had started as language lessons had turned into something much deeper and more dangerous. Marlene found herself waking up early just to read Ahmed's morning messages, and her nights were consumed by video calls that lasted until the wee hours. Klaus began to notice more obvious changes in his wife's behavior. Marlene had lost weight, was always well-groomed even for simple household chores, and showed a renewed interest in her appearance that he hadn't seen since the early months of their relationship. At first, Klaus was flattered, assuming that Marlene was making an effort to impress him. He had no idea that every carefully chosen outfit, every meticulously applied makeup was for video calls with a man she had never met in person. Little Emma, at 2 years old, became an unexpected complication in Marlene's secret routine. During her calls with Ahmed, Marlene had to make sure her daughter was asleep or distracted by cartoons. She began giving Emma longer baths in the evening, putting her to bed earlier so she could have privacy for their conversations. Klaus interpreted this as signs that Marlene was becoming a more organized and efficient mother. Ahmed showed genuine interest in Marlene's motherhood, asking questions about Emma and expressing a desire to meet her one day. He talked about how children were considered blessings in Arab culture, how they were valued and protected. Marlene was touched by this attention, especially since Klaus rarely showed any real interest in daily activities with Emma, seeing childcare primarily as a female responsibility. In their conversations, Ahmed began to subtly introduce criticism of the Western lifestyle and the treatment Marlene received from Klaus. He questioned why such a young and beautiful woman was confined to such a limited domestic life, why she didn't travel, why she didn't explore the world. He painted a picture of what her life would be like with him. Constant travel, luxury, a life where she would be treated like a queen. The second money transfer took place at the end of June. Ahmed explained that his real estate transaction had become even more complicated and that he needed 2,000 euros to resolve urgent legal issues. This time, Marlene did not hesitate for a moment. She had become completely emotionally dependent on Ahmed, and the idea of disappointing him or losing him because of money was unthinkable. To get the money, Marlene had to be more creative. She sold some jewelry she had inherited from her grandmother, explaining to Klaus that she was cleaning house and that the pieces were too old for her current taste. Klaus thought it was strange but didn't question it. Marlene also began to obsessively economize on the household budget, buying cheaper brands at the supermarket and cancelling magazine subscriptions and services that the family used. Ahmed received the money with exaggerated gratitude, sending virtual flowers through apps and promising that he would soon be in Germany to pick her up. He began to talk about concrete plans for a face-to-face meeting, describing what it would be like when they finally met in person. Marlene began to fantasize about this meeting, imagining what it would be like to kiss him, touch him, be physically present with someone who made her feel so special. During this period, Marlene began to have recurring nightmares. She dreamed that Klaus discovered her conversations with Ahmed and kicked her out of the house, leaving her without Emma. She would wake up in a cold sweat, but interpreted these dreams as signs of her guilt for hiding something from Klaus, not as warnings that something was wrong with the whole situation. The third transfer was requested in July. Ahmed explained that there was a unique investment opportunity that could solve all their financial problems once and for all, but he needed 5,000 euros quickly. This time, Marlene knew she didn't have that amount available. That's when she made a decision that would change everything. She decided to borrow money using Klaus's name as collateral. Marlene forged her husband's signature on bank documents, claiming a medical emergency in the family that Klaus had preferred to keep secret. The bank manager, who had known the family for years, approved the loan without asking many questions. Marlene justified to herself that she was only anticipating something Klaus would do willingly if he knew the truth about Ahmed and how happy she felt for the first time in years. When Klaus received a call from the bank a few days later informing him of the loan, his first reaction was confusion. He didn't remember signing any documents, but assumed he had forgotten due to stress at work. Marlene confirmed the story about a family emergency, inventing details about a sick aunt who needed urgent surgery. Klaus accepted the explanation, although something seemed strange about the whole situation. Ahmed received the 5,000 euros and immediately began talking about plans to travel to Germany. He said he would arrive in Frankfurt at the end of August and that they could finally be together. Marlene began fantasizing about what it would be like to leave Klaus, how she would explain it to Emma when she was older, what her new life with Ahmed in Dubai would be like. It was at that moment that Karim Ben Ali, the real man behind Ahmed's persona, decided it was time to execute the next phase of his plan. He had extracted almost 8,000 euros from Marlene over 4 months, but he knew she had the potential for much more. It was time to convince her to leave Germany and meet him in person. It was time to turn a virtual victim into a physical victim. In his messages, Ahmed began to pressure Marlene about the need to meet as soon as possible. He said he couldn't wait any longer, that longing was consuming his soul, that they needed to be together to start their real life. He suggested that instead of him traveling to Germany with all the bureaucratic and visa risks, it would be more romantic if she traveled to meet him in a neutral location, perhaps Morocco, where he had business to take care of. Marlene, completely emotionally involved and already beginning to mentally plan her escape from Bamberg, did not see the warning signs that were accumulating. She did not question why Ahmed never sent spontaneous photos, why their video calls always took place at specific times, why he always had excuses for not making impromptu calls. She didn't realize that she was being carefully manipulated by an experienced predator who had studied each of her vulnerabilities and was ready to exploit them all. August 2023 arrived with palpable tension in the Hoffman household. Marlene had become a completely different person, nervous, distracted, always checking her phone. Klaus, who had initially attributed his wife's changes to stress or women's issues, began to suspect that something more serious was going on. The last straw came when he found Marlene crying in the bathroom after a video call she had abruptly ended when he came home early from work. When Klaus tried to talk to Marlene about her strange behavior, she became defensive and aggressive, accusing him of being controlling and possessive. It was the first time in 4 years of marriage that she had responded this way, and Klaus was genuinely shocked. Marlene, for her part, was projecting onto him all the guilt she felt for her emotional and financial betrayal, as well as the growing pressure Ahmed was putting on her to make a final decision about her future. And Ahmed had become more insistent about meeting in person. He said he had booked a suite at a 5-star resort in Marrakesh, Morocco, and was waiting for her at the end of August. He sent photos of the place, stunning images of luxurious rooms, infinity pools, breathtaking views of the Moroccan Atlas Mountains. What Marlene didn't know was that these photos were taken from tourism websites and that Karim had never been to any of these places. The psychological pressure Karim exerted on Marlene was calculated and relentless. He alternated between declarations of passionate love and subtle threats that he would lose interest if she did not show real commitment to the relationship. He questioned whether she really loved him, whether she was just playing with his feelings, whether she was just another Western woman who liked to flirt with Arab men without serious intentions. Marlene felt trapped between two worlds. On the one hand, her life in Bamberg, which now seemed unbearably small and suffocating. On the other, the promise of a life of luxury and passion with Ahmed, who offered her everything she felt she was missing with Klaus. The only thing that held her back was Emma, and even then, Ahmed had begun to plant seeds about how wonderful it would be for the child to grow up in a multicultural environment surrounded by luxury and opportunities. In mid-August, Marlene made a decision that shocked even herself. She decided she would travel to Marrakesh. She began obsessively planning every detail of the trip, researching visas, vaccinations, climate, currency. She opened a secret bank account where she deposited small amounts whenever possible, preparing financially for the trip. The excuse Marlene came up with for Klaus was elaborate and convincing. She said that her best friend from childhood, Petra, who had moved to Spain years ago, was going through a crisis in her marriage and had begged Marlene to visit her. Marlene explained that Petra had threatened to hurt herself if she was left alone, and that she felt compelled to help a friend in despair. Klaus, though concerned, couldn't deny such a seemingly selfless request. What made the lie even more convincing was that Marlene did indeed have a friend named Petra who lived in Spain, although they hadn't spoken in over 2 years. Marlene went so far as to create fake WhatsApp conversations with a number she claimed was Petra's, showing Klaus desperate messages asking for help. Klaus, who had never met Petra in person, had no way of verifying the authenticity of the messages. Emma's issue became the biggest emotional obstacle for Marlene. She couldn't take her daughter to meet a man she had met on the internet, but the idea of leaving her for a whole week tore her apart. Ahmed was adept at manipulating this concern. saying that a week away would actually be beneficial for Emma to get used to other people, preparing her for the future changes that would come when they were together permanently. Klaus offered to take time off work to look after Emma during Marlene's trip, but she insisted it would be better to leave the girl with Klaus's mother, Ingrid Hoffmann, who lived just 2 hours away from Bamberg. Marlene argued that Emma adored her grandmother and that it would be an opportunity for them to grow closer. In reality, Marlene wanted Emma away so that Klaus wouldn't notice details that could compromise her false story. In the days leading up to the trip, Marlene became almost maniacal in her preparations. She bought new clothes, expensive beauty products, and sexy lingerie, which she hid at the bottom of her suitcase. She researched Morocco extensively, memorizing facts and information to make her story more convincing in case Klaus asked questions when she returned. Ahmed sent daily messages with countdowns to their meeting, describing in romantic and erotic detail what he would do when they were finally together. He talked about camel rides at sunset, candlelit dinners on private terraces, nights of passion that would make up for all the months of virtual waiting. Marlene read these messages over and over, feeding fantasies that had become more real to her than her own life in Bamberg. 3 days before departure, Marlene made her final transfer to Ahmed, 3,000 euros she had obtained by selling the car Klaus had given her as a gift on her 24th birthday. She told Klaus that the car had given her expensive problems and that it was better to sell it and use public transportation temporarily. Ahmed said the money would cover extra travel expenses and ensure she had everything she needed to be treated like a princess. The night before the trip, Klaus noticed that Marlene was strangely emotional. She hugged Emma for long minutes, as if saying goodbye forever, and was particularly affectionate with him, making love with an intensity he hadn't felt in months. Klaus interpreted this as natural anxiety about leaving the family for the first time since Emma was born. But for Marlene, it was a farewell. She wasn't sure if she would return to Bamberg or send for Klaus and Emma once she was settled into her new life with Ahmed. When Marlene finally boarded the flight to Casablanca with a connection to Marrakesh, she was convinced she was flying toward her destiny and the happiness she deserved. She didn't know she was flying straight into the hands of a predator who had orchestrated every moment of this journey, and that her life was about to take a turn she could never have imagined in her worst nightmares. The Marrakesh airport was a whirlwind of colors, sounds, and smells that immediately disoriented Marlene. After nearly 8 hours of travel with a connection in Casablanca, she felt exhausted, but at the same time electrified by the proximity of her meeting with Ahmed. Her heart was racing as she passed through immigration, her hands trembling slightly as she handed her passport to the Moroccan official who stamped her entry into the country without asking any questions. Ahmed had promised to pick her up at the airport, and Marlene eagerly searched for him among the crowd of people holding name signs. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times, the instant recognition, the passionate embrace, the kiss that would finally seal their physical union. But as the minutes passed and the arrivals area emptied, a growing anxiety began to take hold of her. Marlene checked her phone repeatedly, but there was no sign of Ahmed. She tried calling him, but the calls went straight to voicemail. She sent desperate messages via WhatsApp, but saw only a single checkmark, indicating that the messages had not been delivered. 2 hours after landing, she was alone at the airport, with 2 heavy suitcases and a growing sense of panic. That's when a man approached her. He was Moroccan in his 40s, well-dressed, and spoke hesitant but understandable German. He said his name was Omar and explained that he was a friend of Ahmed's who had been sent to pick her up because Ahmed was dealing with a last-minute business emergency. Omar showed her messages on his phone that appeared to be from Ahmed, explaining the situation and asking Omar to take good care of Marlene. Marlene hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but she was exhausted, confused, and Omar seemed to know details about her that only Ahmed would know. Her full name, details about her flight, even the fact that she had left a young daughter in Germany. Reluctantly, she agreed to go with Omar, who took her to an apparently expensive car parked outside the airport. During the drive through the city, Omar was charming and attentive. He explained that Ahmed was dealing with a serious problem related to an investment, but that he would be free the next day. In the meantime, he would take her to the hotel where Ahmed had made a reservation. Marlene watched the busy streets of Marrakesh from the window, trying to absorb the reality of finally being in the same country as Ahmed, even if the circumstances were not exactly as she had imagined. The hotel Omar took her to was not the five-star resort Ahmed had shown her in the photos. It was a mid-range establishment, clean but simple, located in the old Medina of Marrakesh. Omar explained that Ahmed had changed the reservation at the last minute for security reasons related to his business. He handed Marlene a key and said that Ahmed would contact her soon. In her room, Marlene tried to process what was happening. Something was definitely not right, but she forced herself to believe that these were just temporary complications. Perhaps Ahmed really was dealing with business problems. Perhaps he was more careful about security than she had imagined. She took a shower, put on one of the new outfits she had bought especially for the trip, and waited. Omar returned a few hours later with an invitation to dinner. He said that Ahmed had asked him to show Marlene around Marrakech while she waited, and that he knew an excellent restaurant in the Medina. Marlene, who hadn't eaten since the plane and was feeling increasingly isolated and confused, accepted the invitation. Dinner was at a traditional Moroccan restaurant with live music and dancers. Omar was the perfect host, ordering special dishes, explaining the local culture, and making Marlene laugh with stories about life in Marrakesh. He offered wine, then shots of a local drink that he said was traditional for visitors. Marlene, who normally drank very little, accepted everything, trying to relax and enjoy the experience. As the evening progressed, Marlene began to feel strange. The drink seemed stronger than it should have been, and she felt increasingly dizzy and disoriented. Omar suggested they return to the hotel, and Marlene agreed, thinking that a good night's sleep would help her feel better and that perhaps Ahmed would show up the next morning. At the hotel, Omar insisted on accompanying her to her room to make sure she arrived safely. Once there, he asked to use the bathroom. Marlene, who could barely stand, sat down on the bed and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Omar was standing in front of her with a completely different expression than he had had all day. It was at that moment that the terrible reality began to dawn on her. Omar was not Ahmed's friend. Ahmed, in fact, did not exist in the way Marlene had imagined. The man she had been corresponding with for months, to whom she had sent thousands of euros, was actually Karim Ben Ali, who worked with a network of accomplices, including Omar, to lure European women to Morocco. Omar coldly explained that Marlene was now under their control and that it would be best for her to cooperate. He showed her photos on his phone, intimate photos that Marlene had sent to Ahmed during their private video calls, photos that were now being used to blackmail her. He also showed her detailed information about her life in Germany, about Klaus, about Emma, information that could be used to destroy her family if she didn't obey. Marlene tried to scream, but found that her voice was weak and hoarse. The drink had been spiked with sedatives, leaving her physically and mentally vulnerable. Omar took her passport and phone, explaining that these were temporary security precautions. He said she would remain at the hotel for a few days while they resolved her situation, and that she would be fed and cared for as long as she cooperated. In the days that followed, Marlene was kept in a state of controlled confusion. Omar visited daily, sometimes with other men, always maintaining the facade that they were friends of Ahmed's and that the situation would be resolved soon. They controlled her food, giving her meals she suspected were being spiked to keep her docile and disoriented. Karim finally appeared on the fourth day. He looked nothing like the photos he had sent as Ahmed. He was older, less attractive, with a menacing presence that contrasted sharply with the virtual charm he had exerted for months. He spoke to Marlene in perfect German, revealing that he had studied in Germany and was intimately familiar with the culture and psychology of German women. Karim explained that Marlene had two options. She could cooperate with them and eventually be released, or she could resist and face serious consequences not only for herself, but for her family in Germany. He showed evidence that his associates knew Klaus's address, the school where Emma played on the playground, the family's daily routine. The message was clear. Her family's safety depended on her obedience. The first 2 weeks of Marlene's captivity passed in a fog of controlled terror and confusion. Karim and his organization had perfected a system of psychological breakdown that mixed drugs, isolation, emotional manipulation, and carefully calculated threats. Marlene was kept in a state of chemical dependency that left her lucid enough to understand her situation, but not enough to form coherent escape plans. During this period, Karim implemented the cruelest phase of his operation. He forced Marlene to record video messages for Klaus, explaining that she had decided to stay in Morocco longer because she was finding herself and discovering a new perspective on life. In the recordings, which were made under extreme duress, Marlene appeared strangely calm and disconnected, an effect of the sedatives she was regularly given. Klaus, receiving these videos via WhatsApp from Marlene's phone, was deeply disturbed. The wife he knew would never speak that way, would never extend a trip without proper notice, would never leave Emma for so long. He tried calling repeatedly, but the calls were always answered by a voicemail in Arabic. The text messages he received were short and evasive, very different from Marlene's normal communicative style. Emma, only 2 years old, did not fully understand her mother's prolonged absence, but Klaus saw signs of stress in the girl. She woke up crying at night, constantly asked when Mama would come home, and refused to eat certain foods that only Marlene could get her to accept. Klaus, torn between concern and frustration, began to consider the possibility that his wife was having some kind of nervous breakdown. In Morocco, Marlene's situation was rapidly deteriorating. Karim had revealed the true purpose of his operation. She would be prepared to work in a sexual exploitation ring that catered to European tourists in various cities across North Africa. The preparation process involved completely breaking down her psychological resistance and creating total physical and emotional dependence on her captors. Marlene was transferred to a house in a residential neighborhood of Marrakesh, where she discovered she was not the only victim. There were 3 other European women in similar situations. A 30-year-old Italian who had been lured by a different version of the same scam, a 26-year-old French woman who had been there for over a year, and an older German woman, 45, who seemed to have completely lost touch with reality. The older German woman, whose name was Brigitte, became a terrifying warning of what Marlene could become. Brigitte had arrived in Morocco 2 years earlier, lured by similar promises of love and a new life. Now she could barely form coherent sentences, lived in a state of total submission, and seemed to have completely accepted her situation as normal. Karim used her as an example to new victims of what happened to those who resisted for too long. During her first weeks in the house, Marlene tried to escape twice. The first attempt was thwarted before she even left the room. The house was monitored by cameras, and her captors were alerted the moment she tried to force the window open. The punishment was severe. She was deprived of food for 2 days and forced to watch videos of her family in Bamberg being followed by Karim's associates in Germany. The second escape attempt was more elaborate. Marlene managed to convince one of the other women, an Italian named Sofia, to try to escape together during the night. They managed to leave the house and reached a busy street where they tried to ask passers-by for help. However, they discovered that some local residents were accomplices or at least knew about the operation and refused to help. They were recaptured in less than 2 hours. The punishment for the second escape attempt was devastating. Marlene was forced to watch Sophia being severely beaten as an example. In addition, Karim showed Marlene recent photos of Klaus taking Emma to the playground in Bamberg, taken by one of his associates in Germany. The message was clear. Any further attempts to escape would result in direct consequences for her family. It was after this second failed attempt that Marlene began to break down psychologically. The combination of drugs, isolation, witness violence, and constant threats to her family began to break her mental resistance. She began to obey orders without question, accept the adulterated food without resistance, and participate in the training that Karim imposed on the women. During this period, Klaus in Germany was taking his own desperate measures. He had contacted the local police in Bamberg, explaining that his wife had disappeared in Morocco and that his communications with her did not seem normal. However, German police explained that technically Marlene was not missing. She was sending messages regularly, had traveled voluntarily, and there was no concrete evidence of a crime. Klaus also tried to contact the German authorities responsible for citizens in distress abroad, but faced frustrating bureaucracy. Without clear evidence that Marlene was in danger, and with messages apparently coming from her saying she was fine, there was little the authorities could do officially. Desperate, Klaus decided to hire a private investigator specializing in international cases. Thomas Berger was a former police officer who had worked on cases of Germans missing abroad. When Klaus showed Thomas Marlene's videos and messages, the investigator immediately identified red flags: Marlene's body language, certain inconsistencies in the messages, and patterns he had seen in other human trafficking cases. Thomas explained to Klaus that there were organized networks that specifically targeted European women using fake profiles on social media and apps to lure them to North African countries. He said that Marlene's case had all the hallmarks of this type of operation, and that they needed to act quickly if they wanted to have any chance of finding her. As Klaus and Thomas began planning a trip to Morocco to search for Marlene, she was undergoing her final transformation in captivity. After a month of conditioning, Karim announced that she was ready for the next phase of the operation. Marlene would be transferred to a coastal town where she would begin working to pay off her debt, the costs of her upkeep, accommodation, and the damage her escape attempts had caused. The night before the transfer, Marlene experienced a moment of mental clarity between doses of sedatives. She realized that she was about to cross a line from which she might never return. It was in this moment of desperate lucidity that she made a decision that would change the course of the entire situation. She had managed to hide a small kitchen knife that she had noticed during one of the supervised meals, determined to use it against herself or her captors when the time was right. Marlene's transfer to the coastal town of Essaouira took place on a cold October morning. She was transported in a van, along with Sophia and 2 other women she had met only briefly at the house in Marrakesh. During the 4-hour drive, Marlene kept the small knife hidden against her body, waiting for the right moment to use it. Her mind, though still affected by sedatives, was clearer than it had been in weeks. In Essaouira, they were taken to a complex that ostensibly functioned as a tourist guest house, but in reality served as the base for Karim's trafficking operation. The location was strategically situated in the old Medina, where the constant movement of tourists masked the illegal activities taking place on the upper floors. Marlene was placed in a small room on the 3rd floor, with a single window overlooking an internal courtyard. Karim explained that she would have 3 days to adapt to her new environment before starting work. During those 3 days, she would be introduced to the rules of the place, meet the other employees, and receive what he cynically called customer service training. On her first night in Essaouira, Marlene made a desperate decision. She used the small knife to make superficial cuts on her wrists, not with the intention of killing herself, but to create physical evidence of her situation that could be documented if she managed to escape or contact the authorities. She also wrote a detailed letter on small pieces of paper, describing her location, the names of the criminals, and the nature of the operation, hiding the papers in different parts of the room. Meanwhile, in Germany, Klaus and investigator Thomas Berger had arrived in Marrakesh. Thomas had used his international contacts to identify possible locations where Marlene might be held. They visited several hotels, showed photos of Marlene, and gradually began to piece together a picture of her movements in Morocco. It was a taxi driver in Marrakesh who provided the first real clue. He remembered seeing a woman matching Marlene's description a few weeks earlier in a visibly disturbed state, being escorted by two Moroccan men near the Old Medina. The taxi driver had been concerned at the time, but had not interfered because the men appeared to know her. Thomas was able to track down the house where Marlene had been held in Marrakesh through a network of local informants he had cultivated during years of working in the region. When they arrived at the house, it was already empty. But Thomas found evidence that multiple women had been held there recently, forgotten women's clothing, toiletries, and most crucially, a small note in Italian written by Sofia, warning of the transfer to Essaouira. The race against time intensified when Thomas received information that the operation in Essaouira was planning to move its merchandise to other countries in the region in a matter of days. They traveled immediately to the coastal city, arriving there the same night that Marlene was making her desperate cuts to her wrists. In Essaouira, Marlene's situation deteriorated rapidly. Karim had noticed that she was more resistant and alert than the other women, and decided to accelerate her training. He increased the dosage of sedatives and implemented a more severe regime of psychological breakdown, including sleep deprivation and exposure to traumatic situations involving the other victims. It was during one of these training sessions that Marlene made her final decision. Karim had brought a client to meet her, a European tourist who was part of the operation's network of consumers. When the man tried to touch her, Marlene used the small knife she had hidden, superficially wounding him in the arm and creating a commotion that alerted other legitimate guests at the inn. The resulting commotion caught the attention of local authorities who were already investigating the guest house due to reports from neighbors about suspicious activity. When Moroccan police arrived on the scene, they found not only Marlene and the other victims, but also extensive evidence of the human trafficking operation. Klaus and Thomas arrived at the Essaouira police station just as Marlene was being taken to the local hospital for treatment of her injuries. The reunion was devastating. Marlene was physically and emotionally destroyed, barely able to recognize her husband and panicking whenever men approached her. Karim and several of his associates were arrested during the police operation, but the investigation revealed that the network was much more extensive than initially imagined, with tentacles extending across several North African countries and connections in Europe. Marlene was one of the key witnesses in the case that eventually led to the dismantling of a significant human trafficking operation. Marlene's recovery was long and complex. She spent 2 weeks in a hospital in Rabat, being treated for chemical dependency, malnutrition, and severe psychological trauma. Klaus remained by her side throughout the process, grappling with his own guilt for not having noticed the warning signs earlier. When they finally returned to Germany, Marlene began intensive rehabilitation treatment that lasted over a year. She struggled with addiction to sedatives, post-traumatic stress disorder, and deep depression. The process of rebuilding her relationship with Emma was particularly painful, as the girl had been traumatized by her mother's prolonged absence and dramatic change in behavior. Klaus, for his part, had to face the reality that his marriage had been built on fragile foundations, Couples therapy sessions revealed that the emotional vulnerability that had made Marlene susceptible to Karim's manipulation was directly related to unresolved issues in their relationship. The trial of Karim and his associates took place 2 years later, with Marlene testifying via video conference from Bamberg. Her courage in testifying helped secure significant convictions for those primarily responsible for the operation. Karim was sentenced to 20 years in prison in Morocco, and international warrants were issued for his accomplices who remained at large. Marlene's story became a case study for German and Moroccan authorities on the sophisticated methods used by human trafficking networks to lure victims through digital platforms. Her experience contributed to changes in investigation protocols and awareness campaigns about the dangers of online relationships with people never met in person. 3 years after her ordeal in Morocco, Marlene had partially rebuilt her life. She and Klaus eventually separated amicably, recognizing that their marriage had been ill-suited from the start. Marlene found work as a counselor at an organization that helped victims of human trafficking, using her experience to help other women who had been through similar situations. Emma, now 5 years old, remained with Klaus, but kept in regular contact with Marlene under therapeutic supervision. The girl was gradually overcoming the trauma of the separation, although the effects of the experience would likely stay with her for the rest of her life. The physical scar on Marlene's wrist had almost completely disappeared, but the emotional scars remained. She still avoided using social media apps, had difficulty trusting new people, and occasionally suffered from nightmares about her months in captivity. However, she had found purpose in helping other victims and educating women about the warning signs she had ignored in her own experience.